Stellaris is a really big game, like really big, and understanding how to play it can be one of the most daunting things in gaming. There are so many little mechanics and different areas that all need your near constant attention that it can feel impossible to stay on top of things. Well, it is possible, if a little difficult to start off with, so I thought I'd make this video to help you out if you just picked up the game or are looking to pick it up soon. I've separated this video into sections focusing on the different aspects of the game, so if you're looking for help with a specific part, then just skip to that section marked in the description. I'm going to try to keep things simple so I don't take up too much of your time, but this game is insanely detailed, so this video may be still pretty damn long. If you have any questions at the end, then pop them in the comments and I'll try to help you as best I can. So first things first, choosing your starting empire. There are a lot of preset empires, especially if you own any of the DLC, but you can also create your own. When just starting out, I would recommend using a preset, and good ones to choose from to start off with are any that aren't super, how should I say this, space racist? Basically, you want to go for someone who can make friends with others even if you don't want to. That way you have the option to do either, and you can play how you want while you explore the game. Also, make sure you pick someone who has the tutorial enabled. The tutorial isn't really great since it just tends to chuck a ton of information at you whenever you click on anything, but if you do a bit of reading and listening here and there, you can pick up what a lot of things do. A decent choice are of course the United Nations of Earth, who are pretty diplomatic and can just as easily wage war as they can unite the galaxy. Creating your own empire could honestly be its own entire video, so if you want one, just let me know in the comments and I might just do that. So now you've picked your empire, you pick your game details. A large galaxy means more stars, and if you expand a lot, more management to keep on top of. The galaxy's shape just determines the layout of the map and the stars in it, and this doesn't make a massive difference aside from how easy it is to get around and how defendable certain locations are. If you just want to work out how to manage your empire without interacting with others, you can turn off AI empires, but I think this will probably put you back in the long run as you'll need to then relearn how to play with opponents. Just learn it right the first time and save yourself some time. There are of course a ton more different settings that you can tweak, but the only others I touch at this point are difficulty, if you want to turn it down for your first game, and Iron Man mode, if you want to earn achievements while playing. Again, I'd leave these on default to start off with, so you're on an easy enough difficulty and can use some tactical save loading if you make a mistake. Okay, now we're into the game, you can turn on the full tutorial for some extra info as you go, and then we need to get started so we don't fall behind. But the first thing you want to do is make sure you're paused by pressing space and checking in the top right corner. Quick tip by the way, you can hit plus and minus on your keyboard to speed up and slow down the game to make things easier to stay on top of. Now you're paused, we can get to grips with the user interface. Before you say anything, yes, this UI looks super complicated and has a ton of different symbols and numbers. I promise it's really not that bad once you have a basic understanding. First of all, you should take a look at the top of the screen and see all the resources you have to manage. Energy credits are essentially your basic currency that is used to buy and upkeep most things. Similarly, most things produce it, so just make sure you have more being made than you do being consumed, otherwise you'll be in trouble. Minerals are your raw materials and are used for crafting a lot more of your basic buildings. These are converted into alloys via certain buildings, so make sure you have plenty of these to go around. You create them via planets and mining outposts. Food is of course used to feed your pops that require food. I only specify because some robots don't care for food, so don't need it. And you create this via your planets. Consumer goods are essentially luxury items that are used to keep your pops happy. These are made on planets. Alloys are minerals that have been spiced up and are used for more advanced constructions like star bases and ships. These are normally made on planets but can sometimes be mined very rarely. Influence is basically your political power. You need it to expand into new stars and lay claims on enemy stars, and you can't really earn much more of this than your base production, so spend it wisely when you have it. Unity is kind of like the culture of your empire, and you spend it on new leaders, edicts, and traditions. Science of course affects your research speed and is split into 3 areas. You produce this via research outposts and on planets. And finally, exotic resources are found more rarely in the galaxy and are spent on specialist applications like late game buildings and ships. You can produce these if you find them in the galaxy or trade them with certain NPCs. All of these resources can be traded on the galactic market, and you can either set up automatic trades that occur every month or buy and sell manually. The rest of the stuff at the top is self-explanatory. Empire size is how big your empire is, and the bigger it is, the more penalties you're going to be facing from all the administration costs. Envoys are just characters that you send on certain types of missions that we'll come to later. Population is just that, and the same with starbase and fleet capacity. I don't really feel the need to spell those out for you. You'll also notice these symbols on the left hand side. These are each their own menus with complicated things, but I'll try and explain them as quickly and simply as possible. The icon in the top left shows you your government, any modifiers on it, its relations with others, and allows you to reform your government at the cost of unity. You can also check the demographics of your empire and change how the advisor sounds. Contacts is where you can see every other empire or NPC you've made contact with and interact with them, and we'll come back to this in the diplomacy and espionage section. Situation log shows you all current missions that you have, such as elected leader promises for their term, tutorial missions, and specific research projects. Along the bottom of this, you can go to anomalies, which are found when surveying and can be researched for various results, and victory, which shows you the score of everyone you've discovered and breaks it down based on what you know. The market is what I mentioned earlier, but you can also take part in the slave market if you want to have some looser morals. Planets and sectors shows you all your sectors, which are basically groups of planets, the resources they're producing, and any leaders you've appointed, and does some other cool things that I'm going to leave for now. The expansion planet shows you planets you've discovered and some information about them. You can choose to colonize new planets from this menu and save yourself a bit of time from manually building and sending ships around. Policies are your empire's stance on certain issues like war declaration, orbital bombardment, and everyone's favourite, slavery. Changing these stances locks you into that way for 10 years, so make sure you're sure before you do. Edicts are certain effects that you can spend Unity on to provide various buffs to your empire. You unlock more as the game goes on, and some of them get seriously powerful. Society Management has 3 tabs. Traditions lets you select traditions and options within those traditions to buff your empire in many ways. Upon completing an entire tradition tree, you can choose an Ascension perk, which are basically pretty strong effects tailored to a certain playstyle. If you're looking for some good traditions to choose first, it depends on your empire, but some great ones for most empires are Discovery, Expansion, or Adaptability. In the Relics tab, you can see any relics you've discovered and activate them to unlock more powerful buffs. The Crisis tab is only unlocked if you choose to become the Crisis in the Ascension perks, so don't really worry about it until then. The Ship Designer allows you to create ship templates to use in your fleet and fit various modules to your ships if the automatically generated ones aren't doing it for you. The Fleet Manager shows you all of your fleets and allows you to add ships to them to create the perfect fleet composition for you. You can also make new fleets from here as well as set home bases for all of them. Technology is where you choose research in each of the 3 sectors. Instead of progressing down a linear tree, you instead are presented with a random list of projects to complete each time. Some of course require others to be completed first, but you have to mostly use context to progress this. For example, researching into military will of course eventually allow you to unlock later tiers of ships and modules. Certain projects will be there every time until you complete them, so keep an eye on them to see if they're worth doing now, or if you should leave them for later. If you're not sure what to choose, just take a look at your empire and what sort of help it needs. If your economy is struggling, then go for some resource projects. If you're at war or about to be, go for some military, etc, etc. Factions shows you the different factions inside of your empire and what they're up to. Basically, just try and keep all of your pops happy, and you don't really need to worry too hard about this one. Claims allow you to claim ownership of a system owned by someone else, and use this to declare war on them and take control of said claim if you reach peace whilst owning it. Species allows you to set rights for each species in your empire, as well as modify their genetic makeup to add and remove traits. You can then apply these templates to your population via special research projects. And finally, Leaders shows you all of the leaders in your faction for governors of sectors and planets, scientists, admirals in charge of fleets, and generals in charge of armies. Okay, so now we're done. With the left side of the screen, now onto the right. Don't worry, this one is much easier to understand. The main thing is Outliner, which shows you basically everything in your faction in a simple form. You can see your planets, star bases, shipyards, and ships separated by military and civilian. Nice and simple and great for jumping around in the later game. Along the bottom right, you can change the map view a bunch of ways, and most of them are pretty self-explanatory. I turn on hyperlanes, sectors, and leave on Empire map mode since it's the easiest to understand. Okay, that's pretty much everything you need to know about the UI, so now we can get into how to actually play the game. So every empire starts with one signed ship, one construction ship, a small fleet, and your capital planet. Your signed ship does all of your exploring, surveying new stars, and finding resources and planets for you to exploit. Your construction ship does all of your building. This includes constructing star bases over new stars to expand your empire, resource and research exploitation buildings, and eventually megastructures. Your fleets are made up of your military ships, and different types are unlocked over the course of the game. These of course handle space combat as well as any orbital bombardment. Finally, your planets are of course the homes of your population and will be responsible for the other half of your resource and research production. First of all, hit M and open up the galaxy view. This is where you're going to be spending most of your time in game. You're going to want to select your signed ship and right click on a nearby star and select survey. To know which stars you can travel to, you'll want to enable the hyperlanes as I mentioned earlier. These lines show the routes that stars are connected by, and these are, for now, the only way to traverse the galaxy. If you can, choose a system with a planet, as you'll be wanting to expand as soon as you can. While the signed ship is surveying, you may as well spend some time at completing your starting star. Zoom back into your starting system and order your construction ship to build a mining station above one of the glowing locations. Most empires have the choice of minerals or energy credits, and minerals are better early on since you'll be using them for a lot of your buildings. You can ignore your planet for now, as we'll come back to that later, but you'll be fine for the first little bit while you expand. Finally, you want to set some research to be getting on with. As I mentioned earlier, pick something that will help with what you need. At the start, more research can't hurt, so if you have options to go for that, then go for it. If not, then anything that earns you more resources will go just as well. Now all this is happening, you can finally unpause and let the game play. Once the sign ship is done surveying, you'll want to bring in the construction ship and build a starbase and anything else it can while sending the sign ship elsewhere to explore. This bit of the early game turns into a lot of this. Send out a sign ship to explore and build up your systems with construction ships while you wait. If you discover any anomalies while exploring earlier on, you can just leave them for now as you can come back to them later without any loss of value, and at the start, exploring is much more valuable. It's also a good idea to get a second sign ship on the go as early as possible, as surveying can take some time and it's good to do it as fast as possible to rapid expand early on before you get boxed in. Now it's generally good practice to rush towards choke points that grant access to other systems to keep other empires out and make a strong defensive position should war come a-knocking. Now it's a good time to mention that starbases can be upgraded and fitted with various modules and defensive platforms. There are too many to talk about here, but generally you should build strong defense platforms in these choke points and above your key systems. Everything else can either have a standard base or an upgraded economy focused one. And finally, spread shipyards throughout your empire as much as possible to reduce the reinforcement time later on. So keep expanding outwards and exploring, and you'll likely come across some other factions along the way, and you'll need to assign an envoy to establish first contact. There isn't really much to these events, so just assign someone and check in whenever it tells you to keep things moving. You'll also want to colonize any planet that you can to a high level to exploit them and generate more resources. Anything above about 60 or 70 is pretty decent depending on the size. And finally, you can fill out that starting fleet to 20 ships whenever you have any spare alloys to make sure you have some defense if anyone does come to attack you early on. So to summarize early game, explore as much as possible with your signed ships, expand into the most useful systems you can first, whilst making sure to come back later to fill in the gaps, establish contact with any factions you come across and pray they aren't too much of an early aggressor, and build your fleet to 20 ships by spending any spare alloy you have just in case you need them. As long as you do all of this, you'll set yourself up nicely for the mid-game, which is by far the biggest chunk. Now by this time, you'll probably need to take care of that planet, so let's go over how to take care of this population that you should be amassing. So each planet is the same and different. They are the same in the fact that they can build almost all of the same buildings and districts, and they're different in that their habitability and district capacity changes depending on that type of planet. Now we could go into these differences and how to min-max each and every single planet, but you really don't need to know it to get started. All you need to know is how to keep your planets happy, healthy, and most importantly, profitable. Now we have 4 tabs, although most of the time you'll only be using the one. Planet Summary shows you almost everything of importance about that planet in one place. Starting in the top right, we can see the stability of the planet, which is essentially happiness. If it is high, the planet sees bonuses to pretty much everything, and it does the opposite when it's low. If it falls low enough, you'll be looking at a revolt, so keep an eye on this. Below that, we have the total population. The decisions button shows you various decisions that you can make for that planet, and each of these can have multiple effects and are useful in different situations that are pretty clear by reading them. And then we have possibly the most important area, as it contains info about pretty much everything going on the planet. Crime rate is of course how much crime is occurring, and having too much results in low stability and negative events, so keep people happy and use enforcers to keep everything under control. Housing is essentially your population capacity, and having a high capacity helps with growth and stability. Housing can be increased by districts and buildings. Amenities is the day-to-day resources of your pops, and keeping it high increases happiness. Available jobs and unemployment are pretty straightforward, and it is always better to have more jobs than people. Below you can see which sector, if any, that planet is a part of, and choose to move the capital of that sector to that planet. Under this, you can set the designation of that planet. There are a large number of these to choose from, and each provide different effects for your planet, so choose which one's going to help you at that time, and don't be afraid to change them as many times as you want later on. Alternatively, you can leave this on automatic and let the AI choose what it thinks is best. Moving over to the left, we can see the districts menu. Districts are areas on your planet responsible for providing resources such as minerals, energy and food, as well as advanced resources. You can see the capacity for districts above, as well as how many of each the planet currently has from the number of coloured in boxes. You want to build these to create the resources you need, and you can see the output and consumption of a planet a little down to the right, but this really doesn't matter as all planets share your main resource stockpile along the top of the screen. Just build to keep all of these in the green and you'll be all good. Terraforming is a little complicated in the late game, so we'll leave that for today, as well as Resettle that we passed over earlier. Features shows all the features on the planet and their effects for it. Some of these features are known as blockers, and they prevent extra districts from being built. These can be removed later on via research and spending credits to give you more space to build more districts. Finally, the Buildings tab is where you build your more advanced structures for more complicated and nuanced purposes. The main building is a planetary administration, and this provides the basics needed for your planetary life and can be upgraded to increase your capacity for buildings. You can also increase building capacity by building city districts. The range of buildings you can build expands as the campaign goes on. It can also upgrade some buildings for more powerful effects, but they basically all work like this. They consume some resources to spit out some other resources, so you have to decide what you can afford to spend to get what you need. For example, you can consume 2 energy credits and 12 minerals to craft 9 alloys using alloy foundries. It all comes down to what your empire needs, so keep an eye on the top of the screen and build accordingly. If you're doing well on every single resource, then just spam research, because you can't really go wrong having more science. The other 2 tabs are much simpler. The population tab shows you a breakdown of your planet's population, including the different tiers of worker, as well as the demographic and immigration and emigration rates. Finally, the armies tab shows you the defensive army for that planet that will defend it should a ground invasion come. You can also recruit ground armies here that can be used to bolster your defenses or invade other enemy planets. Finally, you can recruit a general to command these ground troops and improve their performance. The corporate tab only does anything if you're playing as a mega corporation, so most of the time you can ignore it. Fleets are your ships that will take part in space combat, and there are a few varieties to choose from your basic tiny corvettes all the way up to your massive juggernauts. Building your fleets from a combination of all the different ship types is almost as important as the raw power of the fleet itself, as having a bunch of slow-moving larger ships is all well and good until they're getting outran and outmaneuvered by a bunch of tiny corvettes. You also have accuracy and different weapon sizes to consider, but as a simple rule of thumb, you can do this and do kinda decently. Bring a bunch of corvettes, like 1/3 to 1/2 of a fleet's size, and then fill the rest up with a fairly balanced mix of the other ship types you have unlocked. So whether that's just cruisers or everything up to the really hecking chunky boys, bring a mix of those so you have some weaponry of every kind to take on enemies of every kind. Now, ship design is one of those things where there's not really a bad way to do it, since as long as you're using the newest tech, the ship you make is probably going to be alright, but that doesn't mean there aren't some scenarios where certain things are better than others. There is a very complex damage system in Stellaris, but it all comes down to a rock, paper, scissors kind of system. Generally, energy weapons lose to shields but beat armor and hull, penetrating weapons ignore shields but do less damage to armor and hull, kinetic weapons are strong versus shields and hull, but weak to armor, and explosives ignore shield and deal decent damage to the rest, but can be countered by point defense. So if you're going against an enemy that you know is going to be using loads of shields, spec your ships with kinetic weaponry. If they're also known to use a lot of energy weapons, then build some shields of your own. Granted, the times where you know this before a fight are pretty limited, so most of the time, taking either a mix of specialist crafts or a bunch of jacks of all trades will likely be your best bet. Alternatively, if you'd like to automatically pick the highest ranking ship that you can craft, you can leave it to the computer to auto build your ships for you. This is for sure not the most optimal way to play, but when you're just getting started, it will be passable and help you learn the rest of the game first. And that nicely brings us into what I would call the beginner's best friend and biggest issue, automation. Of course, with an empire so big, automation is an option to take some of the strain off of you and allow you to focus on the grand scheme of things rather than having to get involved in every single decision. As I mentioned, you can automate shipbuilding to save you from having to rebuild ships every single time you complete research, but you can also automate a hell of a lot more. To name a couple of the less intense options, you can unlock research that allows your assigned ships to automatically survey the map to completion, as well as a project that allows you to automatically choose your research projects, meaning it will go on and on till there is nothing left to learn. Perhaps the biggest and deepest automation is planet and sector management. Now, planets can be automated in a number of ways. When on the planet menu, you can set the specialization to one of a few options, as we mentioned earlier, but you can automate this to allow the AI to choose the best one for that planet's specific circumstance. As well as this, once a planet is in a sector, you can set that sector's focus from the planet and sectors menu, and this by itself doesn't do too much. But if you add to this fund either by direct depositing or a monthly payment, then things start to get interesting. Your sectors will use these resources to build buildings and districts that push them towards your chosen sector focus. These sector focus options are balanced, which of course balances everything as equally as possible, production, which focuses on production of raw materials like credits and minerals, manufacturing, which focuses on advanced resources like alloys and consumer goods, and research, which of course focuses on more research. Each of these are fairly self-explanatory and push your sector towards each area of the economy. I usually left most sectors on balance to try and keep on top of everything, and this sometimes worked and sometimes resulted in me losing massive amounts of everything, while the computer decided it would be a good idea if everything in my empire ate all my credits. This is kind of my main problem with automation. It's alright for the most part, but it doesn't perfectly optimize your empire for exactly what you need. It just kind of guesses what should work and goes for that. In the long run, you are much better off doing everything manually, but when you are getting started, it's fine to automate everything while you get to grips with the rest of the game. So while you're getting on top of managing your own empire, you'll also need to learn how to communicate with others and either engage in diplomacy to share information and resources, or go at it the less honest route of espionage. Both of these are done from the same place, the contact screen. From here you can select any other empire in the game and select the Diplomacy or Espionage tab. Diplomacy first. From here you can do a wide array of actions, and most of them are fairly self-explanatory, like non-aggression pacts and closing borders don't really need explaining. Some of the less clear options I will explain though. You can choose to send an envoy to an empire to improve or harm relations. This is useful when trying to get someone on side or when you want to justify a war. And of course you can only do one of these at once. You can also send an envoy to establish a spy network, which we'll come back to for espionage. There are agreements for commercial and research sharing, which increases your credits and research respectively. Migration treaties allow your pops to move between your empires, which can allow you to increase the habitability of some worlds by using another species to colonize them. Embassies provide intel into each other's territory. Declaring rivalry makes that empire your rival and allows you to more easily declare war while harming your relations with each other. This works well with insults, which literally just reduce relations. And forming federations is basically like creating space NATO. You can also see a bunch of info on this screen, such as that empire's population and size, their diplomatic weight, empire type and ideologies, and of course their power in relation to you in military, research and economy. Now onto the Espionage tab. Once you have assigned an envoy and they have been there for a while, they will accrue infiltration, which can then be spent on one of many operations. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory when you hover over them, so do a little bit of light reading and they should all make sense. You want to be cautious of the difficulty of these operations, as trying a mission too hard will result in a negative outcome and a lot of wasted time and resources. It's best to try and time these operations with the rest of what you're doing to overwhelm the enemy with attacks on all sides. Of course, avoid doing this too much on your allies, as they won't take kindly if they find out about your nefarious dealings. Once any empire has made contact with 70% of other empires in the game, they can form the Galactic Community, which is kind of like the UN, and has a whole host of complexities that could be their own video. All I'll say on this for now is that most of the time joining it is the way to go, if for nothing else but the communications you gain and the effects you can place on all other empires just by voting. Of course, with all of this diplomacy and espionage, it's inevitable that you'll run into someone that you just can't get on with. When you do, war is almost certainly coming. Nearly every single campaign you play will have a war in it at some point or another. Whether you're the one starting it and trying to dominate the galaxy, or the one defending from an evil tyrant, you need to know not just how to win, but how to use time wisely to make sure you don't lose first. Unlike some other games, wars in Stellaris must be started for a quote-unquote legitimate goal. You can't just go around declaring war on everyone unless you're one of a few types of factions. Most of the time you need a reason, and there are many to choose from. You can declare war with the goal of conquering some systems that you've claimed ownership of. You can aim to vassalize a target empire. You can even declare war just to humiliate your rival. So once you've set your goal, you can get to the actual fighting, and unsurprisingly, this consists of sending your fleets to attack your enemy's starbases and fleets to take their systems and weaken their military strength. Taking out a starbase gains you control of that system, and after a little bit of in-game time, that starbase will then be usable by you and fight against enemy invaders, should they enter their space. Planets, however, aren't so easily swayed and must also be invaded by ground troops before ownership changes hands. Ground armies are much simpler than space fleets, since they only have the one damage type, and the only other things you have to worry about is their collateral damage and morale. Just spam out the best units you can and maybe avoid collateral damage, and then just send them back to wherever they're needed. Just bear in mind that while travelling in space, they are literally useless if caught in space combat, so either make sure their route is clear of enemies or send a fleet with them as an escort. Of course, if war is as simple as declaring them mowing through the enemy territory the whole game, then everyone would do it. There's also something else you need to worry about, other than invading and not being invaded: war exhaustion. This is basically a measure of how tired of the war each empire is. It is increased via suffering casualties during the war, such as fleets, planets, ground armies, and of course, whole systems. There is also the passive accumulation from attrition to ensure that no war can go on forever, but some factions are a lot more resilient than others. Gestalt consciousnesses generally don't care, as they're mostly AIs, as well as the belligerent and supremacist empires who see casualties as a necessity for victory. Upon reaching 100% exhaustion, an empire is forced to accept a status quo peace agreement after 24 months of being at 100%. You can use this to take a bunch of enemy land and then declare peace once you are happy, and they'll have no choice but to accept. What this all boils down to is avoid casualties as much as possible and inflict as many as you can on your enemy to break their spirit and force them to end this war on your terms. So some general tips for planning your route through the enemy territory. Those defensive positions you focused on expanding into earlier, those will make for great footholds in enemy lands, as if you choose them correctly, you can cut off a large amount of their territory from themselves and use their own defensive position against them with defensive fleets and a captured starbase. Once you do this, you clean up whatever you've left behind before expanding to the next defensive location and repeating. This tactic ensures you won't be going back and forth to cut off enemy fleets roaming around your captured territory, which is important for getting everything done before maxing your war exhaustion. Planets tend to complicate things, so just keep a ground force on hand in a safe space and move it up as you progress your invasion to capture any planets you come across as quickly as you can. So when you set up your game, you will have set an end date for it, and this is when whichever empire is in the lead will automatically win. Now you can choose to not set an end date, in which case the game will go on forever, but most of the time you're going to want to set a date. Now the score of a faction is determined by a large number of things. Economic strength, which is affected by all of your resource production, technology level, which is affected by every tech more than 60 you've researched. You get 10 points per system, 50 points per colony, and 2 per pop. If you have any vassalized empires, you gain 50% of their score, and you also gain 10% of any allies in your federation score. You gain 10 per crisis ship you've destroyed, which we'll come to shortly, and finally any relics you've collected grant a large amount of score, and relics are special items that are found during certain excavation missions. Now all this is assuming you survive the endgame crisis, which is a catastrophic event that occurs towards the end of the game and normally ruins your day quite a lot. Now there are a few of these to choose from, and they deserve their own video because they are horribly complex, so let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. And that just about is everything you need to know to get started in Stellaris. Like I said at the start, if you have any questions, do leave them down in the comments below and I'll do my best to help you. This game is extremely complicated and fitting everything that you need to know into one video is a massive challenge in of itself. If you enjoyed this video, then do be sure to leave it a like, I really would appreciate it. And if you want to see more content like this going into more detail on certain aspects of Stellaris, then subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what you'd like to see. I'd like to take this last little bit of time to thank all supporters of the channel, like Adam T and Dominic Schmass, and of course Henry Tucker for his support at the On Clean Ones tier. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on YouTube by becoming a member, on Twitch by subscribing, or on Patreon by becoming a patron. Every single supporter gets listed on the end screen and gets shoutouts, just like all of these wonderful people. A last massive thank you to all supporters, one final thank you for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.